All right, good morning, evening, afternoon, guys. Welcome to our video podcast again. It's great to see you. We've had some changes. We had a break for January, but we're back specifically under a little bit of a new name. So instead of Diversis Live, we are now Arts and Offers. We're going to be talking specifically about, for these videos, how to handle your own creative business and lessons we're learning from our own processes because Matthias and I each have businesses that are related to kind of creative endeavors, which is
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. I feel like there's one of these things that's like, Jeff has been like not only like in it for a lot longer, but I think he's like the way that he takes like his art and not only his art but also like the business of art like really seriously is really cool. So I feel like there's so many things that I'm like learning just from kind of being in the sphere of things and thinking of the sphere of like Jeff and the things that you're doing. Like we're in a new space.
Yes, so this is a space that you may have seen referenced on our platforms called The Stanza. It's a space I am renting. It is 100%
Oh, we don't get
putting
to.
my, yeah, I don't have my
I'm
soundboard,
just gonna
but
clap.
I
This is
appreciate that.
this is so weird.
So this is based on renting. My skin's in the game. Look, I'm literally, this is my own income. It's a business expense and stuff like that. But I think that a lot of the ways that I'm handling diverses is I'm trying to show what exactly does independence creatively and financially look like. And I think that means that at some point we're gonna have to spend on ourselves. We're gonna have to invest on ourselves, and that's entirely what this is about.
Mm,
So having the space, I intentionally didn't want to have grants. I intentionally didn't want to, look for donations. It's intentionally about, if I have to invest in myself to get things out of myself, then
mm,
I'm okay with being the model because I think a lot of
yeah,
poets aren't doing that. Poets aren't doing some projects because they don't have the funding for it, or they're
yeah,
not getting funding for it. It's like, well, what if you
yeah,
dropped your own dime on it, if you're able to?
yeah. I think there's something to that because somebody had like an analogy like last year, and it was just like one of the motivational speakers or something like that. And I didn't really key in on a lot of the stuff they said, but one of the things they said was like there's like people that are like they'll work out for a couple weeks and then they'll get like a surgery and they'll do all this other stuff, and that way they'll like lose the weight like surgically, and then they'll become like these like influencers that are like, this is how you work out, this is how you do this. And it's just like, listen, nothing wrong with that path if that's like your path, but I think a lot of it is like you're speaking on a process that you're not pushing yourself because you were like, I did this thing in order to like get to where I am. And I think that one of the things that's like really cool is that like, okay, if we're talking about you as an artist, you have the like your craft, you have like some elements in order to kind of get some things done. Like what are you going to do with what you have in order to push the ball forward, as opposed to kind of waiting for all the other things to kind of fall into place. So really thinking about it like, well, if it wasn't for this grant, if it wasn't for this like person out here that was like funding it, if it was just me, could I really push my art to the next level and have a space where my art can live that is being pushed and motivated by the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah, and I also think this is almost like a way for me to leave breadcrumbs for myself because the things that we're going to be discussing and have discussed, we're very much learning through firsthand experience. So like in terms of creating initial offers for people based around our art and things, and trying to find pain points to solve, and or organizing events and things, like we're very much like on the ground, like doing the things and then kind
Yeah.
of talking about what is the process we're using. But hopefully, if it's helpful for me, hopefully it's also helpful for other people out there too who are thinking about taking their art and their approach to any sort of creative endeavor in a new way.
Yeah, I left breadcrumbs for myself too, but then they kicked me out of Olive Garden,
There
and
were
they said
breadcrumbs, those pieces of raisin bran.
well, those two, but those are a little bit more expensive. I don't like to kind of
This
just
is
leave those
this.
out for everybody. But yeah, no, I think you know what what's so funny though. So we were talking about kind of building up your brand and building up like the assets that you have like attached to your brand. Like this was like maybe like one of like last year's pods, but we were like really just talking about like really kind of being able to categorize like what you have, like what elements you have.
Yeah.
And just recently, so a couple nights ago, with my wife, me and her were just talking about one of her projects, and we are talking about like kind of building out like a project that she's that we're going to be working on like over the next few months. And I found myself kind of in that same space and being like, that the conversation that we had like last year, that really helped inform me kind of like what I'm looking
Mm.
at down on the paper. So I'm like,
Yeah,
we're
that's so
looking
good.
at this, project, and a lot of times we go into these projects and we're just like, let's just go and do it. And then like I think one of the problems with that kind of mentality is that it's like what is the saying? Like, how do you eat an elephant like one
Yeah,
bite at a time?
yeah,
And so it's like, yeah, like we're just trying to like take everything in, but what we ended up doing is kind of sectioning things off, saying, okay, we have these assets that we're going to be pushing towards this project, and what does this need? What does this
yeah.
need? And kind of creating these small worlds in
Mm-hmm.
association with our project. And I think that when we did that, when we actually like did that, like, and we were very strategic about it, we found that really everything that we needed for the project that we could do for the project, like we had. You know what I mean? And I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot to like even something like let's say like renting this room.
Yeah,
Like renting this room might seem like, oh man, like it's way out there for you, like and which is like, I'm not like, depending on your situation and things
right.
like that, but like being able to like rent like a space like this might be like really really out of reach, or it might feel like it's out of reach to you. But if you really sit down, like a lot of people, if you really sat down, you budgeted, you thought about like, okay, well, where do I want to be 5 years from now? Like where do I want this idea to be 5 years from now? If I want this idea to be this big 5 years from now, then at some point I'm gonna have to make some greater version of the
Mm.
investment that I'm making right now. If I'm gonna be, if I want to be an athlete, then like, okay, man, waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning, that sucks because I like my sleep. I like to like sleep in.
Right.
But if I'm young, if I'm like, man, I'm like really in a space where I'm really trying to get to the big leagues, then right now is the time to wake up early,
Mm-hmm.
go get a couple hundred shots off before I go to school. Right now is the time to like, like try to get onto a team. And I think that there's those moments really every day in life. Like really
Yeah.
every day you should be assessing like, okay, are there things that I can cut? Are there things that I can live without right now that way I can really put my all into like this venture or like wherever else I'm doing, because whatever money that is going into like renting this space could have easily just been like, oh man, but I want to I don't know, I want new rims for my car, I want like
Yeah.
this, like there's like all kinds of other things that you
Yeah.
could have like convinced yourself that like, oh, this is like more important. But it's it's really about like, okay, well, if that's more important to me right now, then maybe that is.
Yeah.
But I this thing isn't gonna grow. This thing isn't gonna grow the way I want. But I'm like, it's really cool to see being like, okay, well, there's this started out like we're doing this podcast in Jeff's house, and then there's like a thought like, man, like if but there's gonna be a separate. I know we even talked about this. I think tracking way back to like our first couple podcasts, where like there's this idea of this individual, completely separate poetry
Right.
space. And I'm like, yeah, like there's gonna be a time we're gonna have to pull the trigger on like getting, and it's not gonna. Also, and I know this is long-winded, but this is one last point. I think a lot of times we're thinking the first incarnation of our dream is supposed to be whatever the biggest version of it is.
Right.
You know what I mean? And this goes for stuff like YouTube. This goes for stuff like filmmaking. This goes for stuff like this. It's like very seldomly is somebody's like first movie gonna be like 20 million views on YouTube and this huge rocket ship of success. A lot of times it's going to be you're making a whole bunch of movie, or
Right.
most of the times, actually 99.999% of the times you're making a whole bunch. You have a huge amount of output, and then there's one bit that because of the fact that you're in rhythm, that one takes off, and then other things take off, and then other things take off. Same thing with kind of like with like a space like this, right? It's like, yeah, like you have the idea for what is going to be a much larger version of this, but the first version is not going to be the larger version. This is going to be like a thing that you it's beautiful for what it is, but and you appreciate it for what it is, but you also have to utilize it so you can elevate. So
I like that word version because it's also like, think about what you're doing now and think about what if what you're doing now is version one. So then you can kind of ask yourself, what does version two look like? Because sometimes we do a thing and we kind of just like it, that's just it.
yeah,
But then I think if you ask yourself, what does version two of this look like? Well, then you start allowing yourself to expand
yeah,
and retake it. It's interesting, some of the things you mentioned too. So, for instance, one of the reasons I got the space was we had our retreat recently. So we have a retreat
yeah. I
that
keep
I'm
wanting
trying to. I know, just press the table. It's normally with soundboard with some sound effects. And so traditionally the retreat's been once a year, although I'm trying to look into upping that to 2 or 3 times a year, if not 4. And to rent a retreat space, you're looking at because our retreat's intense time wise. It's basically like a 9 to 5 commitment, 3 days a week. So to find a venue that can fit that, some
yeah,
venues are charging $100 an hour. If you have connections and people are willing to work with you, you're still probably looking at places I'm typically looking at are charging like $100 a day.
yeah,
Versus, so for this space, basically the way it happened was Tim, who owns the space, basically said, "Hey, we have this conference room. This is what the rate would be per month." And I was just thinking, like, okay, well, I can rent a space for a weekend that costs what this costs for a month. And I was like, well, imagine what all the things I could do for a month. So it's almost like there is sticker shock at first, right? Because it's like, man, this is expensive. But then it's like, well, long term, it's actually really cheap.
yeah. Okay, so and this is probably, I don't want to say blow everybody's mind, but it blew my mind when I thought about like what investment looks like whenever you hear something like that and what it reveals about yourself as like an entrepreneur or like an artist. Because if I think a lot of times you have to really reflect, like somebody tells you, okay, well, it's going to be like, I'm going to throw a number out. So let's say in order to run a retreat, it's going to be $500, like for the entire. That's the operating cost. That's how much it's going to cost for you to like run this retreat. And then that sounds like maybe it's a lot, and then but you're willing to do it because you can see the beginning and the end of the retreat.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're like, well, I can see this, I see what I'm getting out of it. Okay, bet. But if somebody tells you like, okay, well, like, but to rent the space for a month, it's going to be $400. A lot of times you're like, man, like that's $400. Like that's a lot. But then it's like the only reason why you feel that feeling is because you are envisioning the stopping point every time. You're always thinking about like, well, once I'm done with it, what am I gonna do? But I'm like, okay, well, hold on. Are you gonna be done with it? Aren't you thinking about having programming here all the time? Aren't you thinking about like, okay, like you really want to build this thing out, and what else could you do with the rest of the time during the month, and then the next
Yeah.
month, and then the next month, and then the next month. And so it's really, I think the word commitment is really kind of like bred in there, because it's like now you're not just thinking about like, okay, what am I doing during this square window of time?
Right.
It's like now it's like there's a space somewhere down the street that if on days, on weeks, if I can't go weeks without using it because I'm invested. I can't just be like, oh well, man, let me just like let it sit there for a little bit. Like, no, you're invested. So that's also a motivator for you to be like, well, hold on, what can I do with this thing? What can I do with that space? It's almost like, um, I think when I got my first camera, my first DSLR, it was a big investment, but it was also like it's a big.
Good save.
Am I Spider-Man? No.
Definitely not. No.
Sorry, guys. Sorry to disappoint you. But yeah, it was a big investment, but it was also like, okay, so I don't want to go, a couple weeks, a couple months, like without using it, without planning and shoot. Even if I'm doing like product photography, like I used to like pull like ketchup bottles and ketchup and mustard and like pair them and like do little product shoots and stuff like that, just so I could be practicing, just so I could be utilizing it, because I was thinking even beyond. I'm like, this is my first really nice camera, but I'm like, this is not the nicest camera I can have, and this is not the end of where I think my camera like acquisitions like will be. And like, I'm eventually going to get this one and this one and this one. Yeah. And so the thought of being like, well, using it is part of my experience. And once you really understand that, like once you wrap your head around that and like are committed to that, well then now it's like, yeah, renting a space like this, it's like, yeah, like, when you're in the poetry show, like in your, like you did Karen Scott's here a couple yesterday. Yeah. Yesterday. Time is linear, guys, for sure. I promise it. But yeah, had Karen Scott's here yesterday, but then we're doing the podcast here today, and like you have things all throughout the week. And I'm like, yeah, like it's really pushing you to be like, well, I have to use it because I have to use it. Yeah. Like I have it.
Yeah. There's I got from Christo, and I don't know where he pulled it from, but the idea that, when you spend money, you're basically like each dollar is a vote for the world that you want to see.
Yeah.
And there's also the idea that, one difference between people and how they handle money is, if you save money to spend it, that's different than if you use money to create something that generates more income for you. Like, just in terms of like layers of wealth, like, so for instance, by renting for this space, all the access for future opportunity that it gives me, versus if I approach it as, if I rent the space, I'm out $400. Well, it's like, no, like it's not that if you rent a space, you're out $400. It's if you rent the space for $400, what are all the things that's then going to bring in for you?
Yeah, you're creating the opportunity for, and a lot of times it's not directly related to money. Right. Maybe it's like tangentially, like maybe I feel like you're like, okay, if I am doing this, if I'm renting this space, then even if it means like I'm renting this space so that I don't have to try to access another space for a different price point every single time. You know what I mean? Like I'm renting this space so that when somebody does approach me and say like, hey, I really want to do like a poetry video, and I think that this would be a good idea. It's the same thing when it comes to like photographers and like photography studios, right? It's like photographers are gonna, once you get to a certain point, you'll be renting photography studios like here and there. But once you get to a certain point, you'll be like, okay, well, like, is it worth my investment to actually just have my own studio space to rent it like long term for myself? And it's because, again, you're not thinking about like, oh man, I'm out this money. It's like, okay, if I spend this money, do I create more opportunities for myself? And like, obviously you do.
Yeah. Like what are new abilities that you gain because of it? Yeah.
That's when I used to buy Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I'm like, well,
I was actually just watching a video. I know nothing about Beyblades. I was just watching a video on Beyblades, which are way more complicated than I thought. And like it's super. Anyways, all right. Talking about all these creative endeavors and things like that. Today, what I really wanted to focus on was, let's say that you're like, all right, I'm in. I want to create something that I can use my own art to benefit others. I want to create something around it. I also want to maybe like design a website, or I want to have like a consistent presence online. One way you can do that is through the use of a logo. If you follow the verses, you may have seen, like, for instance, we have this space called The Stanza. We have different shows and things like that. Like we have the Micro Mic. We have things like Lo-Fi Poet that we're actually looking into. There's a record store next door, so we're trying to bring in a live in-person version of that soon. So keep an eye out for that. But like for all these things, part of the way I want to try to help identify is through the creation of logos, for the website, for these events and things. And so Matthias is going to be our guinea pig for today because Matthias has put it into his calendar. Is
I
it
do
at
have
the
it in
end of
my
the month?
calendar.
Is that at the end of the
Yeah,
month?
hold on.
Matthias
Let
doesn't
me
have a
look.
website, which is a problem because he has his photography and film business, but and sometimes people come up to me like, "Hey, like I want to work with him on a project. What's his website?" And I was like, "Oh, he doesn't have one." So we have put it into
The
his calendar.
27th,
That is on the 27th,
3:30,
3:30. I think it's a 1 or 2 hour block.
3:30 to
And,
5:30.
okay, and he's just going to be using that time to create a website, which is great. One thing that may be helpful if you have a website is you may want a logo for what you're doing. I don't know if you guys have ever looked at design firms. Logos can be very expensive for good reason. There's a lot of things that go into logo and just kind of like the what you stand for, what your goals are, what your mission, and things like that. But if maybe you already have some ideas that are clear to you on that regard, there may be some things you can do on your own to create your own logos. And so we're going to kind of walk through the process for doing that for free. I will say, just as a disclaimer, we're going to be using AI for this. So if you're against using AI art and things like that, this is not going to be the stream for you necessarily, although there may be some concepts that you can apply to maybe using like a photograph that you take. Some of the logos I've done basically like taking objects and using their silhouettes to make like vector images or kind of like clip arty type images and things like that. So that can be a way around that. But Matthias, let's imagine that we're going to make a creative logo for you. Can you tell me a little bit about your business?
Which one?
Let's do the photography one.
Photography? Yeah, for photography, I'm basically doing mostly portrait work, but these are both doing like creative portraits or themed photo shoots, specific, like more often than not for artists. So for like when artists are creating things for their music videos, like if they want like stills and stuff like that for the music videos, or for a like a music video like concept, or for an album art concept.
Cool.
So a lot of it is that I do some like event photography, but for the most part, most of my work is I'm working with other artists on like their projects.
Cool. So once you have an idea of like kind of like the central theme of your work, we can kind of start thinking about some potential images that we can play with. And as I told Massage before, you don't have to use this logo or anything like that. We're kind of just like walking through the process so you guys can kind of have an idea of tools. But just based on kind of some things that you were telling me, I heard the big things I heard like photography, portraiture, and also like in terms of like theme shoots. But I think especially those first elements of photography, like if we think of what's an image of photography?
An image of
Like what's an
photography?
image that you see and you think photography?
Camera?
Camera's probably like camera or
Yeah.
camera lens is probably the first thing I think of for that. And if I'm taking photos of portraiture, what's a way that I can? What does that look like? What's an image of that?
Maybe like a frame?
Could be a frame. I'm thinking like a silhouette of a person. So maybe like no features, but like just kind of like like those
Yeah.
like outline of a person or something like that. So something that immediately came to mind for me is the idea of maybe like a camera or a camera lens, but in the center of the camera lens having like the silhouette of a person. That's something that kind of came to mind for me.
Okay.
Let me see if I can capture that as a logo. And again, this is purely just as like to kind of walk you through the steps. Okay. You can adapt this to your own needs. I'm going to share my screen. A couple websites we're going to be using. Okay, and I'll put them into the chat as well. So the first site we're going to be taking a look at, these are going to be some AI image generators. This first one is bing.com/create. Okay. And allow me to make this a little bit bigger. Make this a little smaller. Okay. So let's imagine, again, I want a logo. So some things that I think are gonna be helpful, at least for times when I've had to do this, would be, I like saying minimalist because I need it to kind of be like an icon. Something that we want to think about with logos is that you want something that can scale. So you want something that can be, whether it's like this small or if it's like this big, like on a poster or something like that, you need it to be identifiable. A problem that I see with a lot of people who are kind of making their own logos is they make something that's really, really complicated. And so it looks great on a poster, but like once you get like the tiny logos, like
Yeah.
imagine like the favicon like icons, like on websites and things like that, you can't see it. It's too complicated.
Yeah.
So we want something that can scale really small, but that can also be identifiable really large. And so one way that I think I've found to be helpful for that is when if we're using like a generator, to include minimalist, because that's going to cut out a lot of the details. Okay. Another thing you may want to try is you may want to try using like black and white. Okay.
Yeah.
Black and white is nice too because then we can play with that later we can change it. Like we can make it, instead of being black and white, we can make it white and black. And we can also think like, for instance, if you're doing a lot of printing, you're not always going to print things in color. So we want things that can also look good, just pure black and white, because not everything is always going to be colored. So I like doing a minimalist. Some other things that may help is using the word like vector. So that's going to give us like a specific image. So I'm going to say like minimalist vector camera with a silhouette in the lens. Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to try this for this one. We're going to give this some time to generate. I'm also going to show you another image generator that we'll use. So this other generator that we're looking at is called Leonardo. And again, I'll put
Not
this.
DiCaprio, but
Definitely, no.
better actor.
So this is Leonardo.ai, and you can Google that to find it as well. Leonardo gives you a lot more options, so you can even see over here that I have the option to kind of change the style. So I can do style. They have things that are more cinematic and things like that. You can do pop art. I'm going to do graphic design vector because we're, again, making a logo. And I'm going to use the same prompt. If it lets me. Okay, and then we can also kind of compare to image generators. There's lots of other image generators out there as well. I think Canva has one now. A lot of your platforms now allow you to do that. So we're going to give that time to generate, but let's see what the ones that Bing made. Bing uses Dolly. So this is kind of what I had in mind. Like something like this, where in the center you can see a person or a person's figure. Okay. I'm going to let it make maybe 2 or 3 more rounds, and then we can kind of pick one that we like. Cool. Any questions for me so far, Matthias?
No, pretty straightforward. I feel like I haven't worked with a lot of these, but I feel like I've seen like the interface for a lot of these on some like YouTube videos. So this is like kind of like watching them work more in depth. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. I will say Leonardo takes a little bit more time. One of the nice things about Leonardo too is you can turn the images into little videos. So it will like kind of like have like the camera kind of like tilt through the scene to kind of give it like a 3D effect too, which can be helpful. Like for instance, let's imagine you're doing video and you want like maybe like some B-roll of your logo or something like that. That might be an option for you as well. Going back to Bing. Okay, so right now the ones that are closest to what I had in mind, and I just did 2 rounds. Bing is free. You can do basically 12 rounds. Leonardo is also free up to, so a lot of that, you'll see this little marker that says 24. You get like 150 a day. So you can make like 5 or 6 batches of 4 images. I might do one more with Bing and then hopefully Leonardo will finish. I will say a lot of times Leonardo's images tend to be, it's a little bit more intense of a program, so the images tend to be a little bit more intricate and detailed. That doesn't necessarily mean better, but you do tend to get something that looks a little bit more cinematic. But that may not necessarily fit what you're going for. Like for instance, for a logo, that might be a little bit too much. Yeah, so probably not these because I really wanted a person. Now, let's say that I had one of these images and it's like I like the image, but I want a person in there. Well, one thing you could combine, like you could take a person and remove the features, lower the contrast so you don't see anything, and then kind of put that. You can like combine things to get more what you want if the initial image isn't doing what you are looking for. Come on, Leonardo. Nothing. Here we go. It's so close. Ugh. Well, in the meantime, I'm going to go back to... What was our first group? I think this one, and again, we want to think things that can scale from distance. If you had to pick one of these that would look good from close up and also from far away, which one you kind of leaning towards?
If I had to pick one of these, probably say this right here.
Okay, that's what I was thinking too. Okay, so if you get one that you like, you can then download it, and then I'll show you some things that we can do with that. See if Leonardo finished. Okay, let's jump on these. That's very meta, the guy looking back at you. And you might be like, Jeff, there's a lot of other details and things here. There's things that we can do to kind of remove the image, which I'll show you in a moment. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm just going to use this one. Okay, so we downloaded it. The next thing that we may want to do with this is, let's say like, hey, I really like this camera. I don't want that background because I want to put this on stuff. Like maybe I want to put it on a shirt, or maybe I want to put it on a flyer. Okay, so what do I do next? So if you go to, we need a background remover. A background remover, a lot of your photo editing sites will have it, or programs, but if you don't have one, one I use a lot is, it's just called remove.bg. But you can just go to Google and type in background remover. Nowadays, these things are free.
If you have Apple, or if you have like an Apple product on your iPhone, if you use Freeform, it'll do a lot of that.
Got you. If you have Photoshop, Photoshop has one in the program. Okay, so what I need to do is then put the image into this. And you're going to see it's going to remove the background. Okay. All right. So then what do we do? So we have the image as a transparent file. So then what we can do, because we might be like, hey, I want to alternate it. So I want it to have like versions. I want to have like a black and white one. I want to have a white and black one and things like that. So then what we can do is we could put it into a photo editing program. If you use Canva, that's fine. I use a mix of my video editors. I find actually are pretty good at also editing pictures because you can just add the graphics on top and things like that. One program I use is called PicFirst from Avavi. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you again. Okay, I'm going to take our image that had the background removed. I'm going to put it on here. Okay, so you can see, when you see those like that grid behind it, that means that you're working with a transparent file. Sometimes it's saved as like a .svg. And now let's make some different versions. We're like, okay, I don't want that color. So what I can do is, in my photo editor, I can remove the saturation. So saturation kind of refers to like the color. So if I don't have saturation, you can see now it's a black and white image. Okay. You might be like, oh, but I don't want like kind of like that fade or whatever. Well, you can do things, you can like play with the contrast. So if you do like high contrast, like something like this. This is something that like if I make this really small, you can still kind of tell that's a camera. Or if I make this really big, again, you can still tell it's a camera. So again, that's kind of what we want with a logo. Okay. So I can save that to your desktop or wherever you need it. And now we got it. Okay. Now you may also be like, okay, great. I have the image. I want to add some text to it. I want to link to my website or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of your like photo things, what you can do is we can add some text. So like, like let's do like www.photoswithme.com. Matthias, don't use that website, please. just don't. We'll give it a color. For me, change the opacity. And try to center it, make it look nice. And save that again.
Is that like photos? Like toes?
Oh, maybe I'm into.
Did I reveal too much?
This is not your industry.
Is that what you do?
My bad. Okay, let's see. See what this looks like. Okay, cool. So now, allow me to share my screen again so we can see what our logo looks like. I'll just share everything. Okay, so now, ta-da, we have our logo. Yeah. So, what can I do with this? Well, if I take an image, let's see, do I have? I'll just put a random image in here. So what can I do with this? I have to put it in my program again, sorry. So now, let's say I wanted to put the logo onto this image. Let's double check you see it's cool. So if I wanted to put the logo into the image, I can insert image, paste image, and we can, I guess was our top one. And now I got my logo, right?
The more you know, the more
So
you know.
if I'm making like a flyer or something like that, I can stick it wherever.
Yeah.
Questions for me about anything?
No, it's all pretty straightforward, man. It's pretty cool.
Cool. Yep, so that is how you can make yourself a logo. And really not that much time necessarily. It can take time to find the right image, obviously, but once you have it, and again, you can, in a photo editor, you can take that transparent file, you can change the colors and flip it around and stuff like that, add text. But yeah. Cool.
Sounds cool, man.
All right.
It's like a PBS episode.
Okay, I'll take it.
That's nice.
So that's basically just the thing I kind of wanted to walk people through today. So, whether you're planning an event, you're creating a service, product, or around your art, maybe you have an author website and you're like, I want a symbol that symbolizes, my website, or for books you're doing or things like that. And these are some steps to consider.
For sure.
Any final thoughts about anything for us?
Not really. What do you got coming up, man?
Yeah, good question. I keep feeling like there's something that happens tomorrow. Like I literally can't remember. But in the meantime, besides that, this week we're out of town. But traditionally on Thursdays we have the Poet Business Institute workshop. We're talking about either like a craft point or a business point, relation to art, or editing poems and things like that. So check out that next Thursday. On Sundays, we have a series called Open Studio, where we allow poets to kind of sign up to kind of give their own featured readings that get recorded and live streamed. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for as well. We have the Micro Mic on Mondays, which again, we have featured readers and discussions through May. And Tuesdays, again, we have the podcast now from, again, typically like around 11 to 12 p.m. New York. So that's kind of the big stuff. How about for yourself?
For me, I have a performance. I'm doing a slam.
Okay.
I guess it's next week. And then outside of that is really just like I'm planning for some stuff. There's some stuff I got coming up, but like I can't really be too public about it yet. Maybe I'll probably have some more news this time next week. So maybe like next week's podcast, and we'll have some more news for you guys.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah, man.
Cool. Well, once again, guys, my name is Jeff.
I'm Matthias.
Thanks for hanging out with us. This is, again, the podcast, Arts and Offers. We're all about trying to help you take your creativity, turn it into a creative business. And if you have questions, things like that, things you'd like to see in the future, let us know. Otherwise, hope you have a good day, have a good night, and a good afternoon. You guys take care.